Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Awa Sar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center, Michigan State University. This is Eye on Africa, our weekly seminary series. I'm very happy and delighted today to have Dr. Sanja Ivkovic, Adri Sauerman and Andrew Faull as our guest speakers. They're going to talk about their book, Police Integrity in South Africa. So brief introduction, Professor Ivkovic is a professor at the School of Criminal Justice, Michigan State University. For more than 2 decades, her research has focused on comparative and international criminology, criminal justice, and law. She received the 2017 Mueller Award for Distinguished Contribution to International Criminal Justice. Adri Sauerman is a legal counsel in the mineral, energy, trading, and commerce industries, as well as a former Fulbright and current independent scholar. As legal counsel, he navigates the legal and governance intricacies of several African and European commercial systems. His research and publications focus on international criminology, criminal justice, and law. And Dr. Faull is a senior researcher in the Justice and Violence Prevention Program at the Institute for Security Studies and a research associate at the Center of Criminology, University of Cape Town. He has over 15 years experience researching policing and related subjects in South Africa. Thank you all for being here. We are appreciative of your presence to share your research and talk about your book. So I'll pass it on to you, Dr. Ivkovic.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the introduction, Ava. I'm Sanja Ivkovic, and my colleagues and I will talk today about our recent book, Police Integrity, that was published by Routledge last year. I have co-authored this book with Adri Sauerman, Andrew Faull, Michael Meyer, and Gareth Newell. I'm happy to say that Adri and Andrew will also participate in this presentation. We'll first tell you about how we got the idea for the book, and then Adri will provide a historical context and will discuss the origins, functions, and the development of the police in South Africa. And we'll follow with an overview of the current social context of policing in South Africa. And before we discuss the empirical results, I'll explain the theory of police integrity that we use in our book. Then I will describe the methodology and show you some of our key results. And at the end of the presentation, we'll provide some concluding remarks. So let's first talk about how we got the idea for the book. Our goal was to systematically and empirically measure the extent of police misconduct in South Africa. Yet past research indicates that it's easier said than done. So the question is why? Well, because there are serious challenges if somebody wants to measure the extent of police misconduct directly. First, the usual witnesses and victims present at the scene may not be credible because of their past criminal records. While credible witnesses, such as other police officers, might be present at the scene, they will be reluctant to talk about what they've seen, even with guaranteed anonymity or confidentiality from the scholars. In addition, even credible witnesses, such as citizens and police officers, could have motives not to talk about police misconduct because such discussion could implicate them with involvement in criminal misconduct themselves. Finally, police administrators may not be willing to open the doors of their agencies to scholars under the assumption the results will be interpreted negatively by the public and potentially could lead toward their dismissal. So the big question is then, how can we measure police misconduct successfully? And that's the same idea, the same question that Carl Klockers and I faced in the mid-1990s when we decided to study police misconduct. So we flipped the issue upside down, and instead of studying police misconduct, we decided to study police integrity instead. So we define police integrity as the normative inclination among police to resist temptations to abuse the rights and privileges of their occupation. Because we shifted the focus of our study from the actual behavior to a set of opinions, it is much easier to measure police integrity than to measure police misconduct. In addition, such an approach expands our horizons because police integrity is a feature of individual police officers as well as police organizations. So this gives us an opportunity to measure the extent of police integrity within a police agency, such as the South African Police Service. Since Karl Klockers and I developed this approach in the 1990s, it has been used by scholars from 30 countries to survey over 30,000 police officers. Going back to the book at hand, we thought that South Africa would be an excellent case study of police integrity. First of all, South Africa has a turbulent past that is marked by instances of injustice, inequality, and violence spread throughout its 350-year-long history. Second, South Africa is a country in transition that is trying to find its way of becoming a true democracy. And third, the police in South Africa are composed of a large centralized police system, the South African Police Service, characterized by a stream of leadership failures, declining levels of police legitimacy, and a widespread belief among the citizens that police misconduct is widespread. For all of these reasons, we thought that South Africa is an illuminating location for an in-depth study of police integrity and factors related to it. Before I explain the theory of police integrity, Adri will now discuss South Africa's past, both history in general and history of policing, as it is related to present-day policing in South Africa.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so I have to go through the slides again. And we've been trying for some time now to write in depth about the history of the South African police and the history of the country. But usually, and we've been doing this for well over 15 years now, usually we are limited in size in journal articles and in book chapters. So then we usually focus on the more spectacular of terrible things in the country's past, like apartheid, like government corruption, and like the revolving door of police commissioners in the current police service. By the way, that's a spoiler alert. And so I think the book eventually gave us the opportunity to write something much more meaningful about the need and the establishment and the operations and the development of the South African police. So before we get into it, just a quick disclaimer on history. And I believe these two sentiments would serve well as disclaimers. The one focusing on the history of South Africa and the other one focusing on history in general. Hopefully today we will be, if everything goes according to plan, we will be definitely discussing some bizarre and peculiar events, and hopefully they will be factual. Kicking off, by the way, after that build up on how extensive we've researched, just a quick note, they still limit me here on my talk. So I'm gonna probably go through 10,000 years of history in a very limited space of time, so it's not going to be that in depth. We're going to be covering millennia in minutes. So if you would go back in time, and yes, we'll stop along the way to buy shares in Tesla and Amazon at a cheap price, and probably some others as well. You go back 10,000 years to the country that's now known South Africa, you'll probably find Khoi and Khoisan farmers, hunter-gatherers, with very weak and political structures and volatile economies. So their wealth was based on cattle ownership. If you had cattle, the more you had, the richer you were, and you could rely on the labor of others and loyalty, of course. The Khoisan went through ecological cycles. In other words, when they did not have, when external circumstances like drought or disease caused their herds to die off, they would just revert back to their day job, being hunters. And the moment they build up their herds again, they would continue to go back to farming. So by the time the Europeans arrived there, and brought in the concept of commercial farming. This really clashed with the entrenched ecological cycles, and of course exacerbated the frequency of these cycles. And eventually, the hunter would there would be conflict between the commercial farmer and the hunter, which of course necessitated law enforcement. So in South Africa, like I think in most countries, the need for the police wasn't really a strategic plan. It was more circumstantial by nature, which is probably why the SpaceX program is not at the moment hiring cops for their 2026 mission to Mars. Now, while we are on the Khoisan, just a quick note in memoriam to Orekwe Langwane. He passed away Sunday. He was the last of the endurance hunters in the Kalahari, and I believe the way that report was written, he was probably the last of the endurance hunters in the world. That's a form of hunting. It dates back 2 million years as opposed to bow and arrow hunting, which is 60,000 years. These guys literally would track their prey for hours at a time until the animal collapses. So they hunt without, or they used to hunt without weapons. So I think the world is poorer without him. So by the time the Europeans arrived in 1652, the Netherlands Dutch Indian Company arrived in what is now known Cape Town. So I'm going to refer to this as the colony or the Cape, even though the VOC never had the intention initially to colonize the area. They just wanted to formalize their sort of like a trade post, their halfway house on one of their trade routes. But of course, the town grew quickly, and by 1655, 3 years later, as we discussed with the Khoisan and the clashes, they established the Dutch Watch. These guys would do border patrol. So that's probably the first policing group in South Africa, and it started off with a sort of military background. You will see this is a theme that continues throughout the history of the South African police. I think Andrew might even touch on that as well. Again, another spoiler alert. So, little side note here, something really interesting that not many people are aware of, that slave assistants to the VOC public prosecutor used to roam or used to do law enforcement in the Cape Colony. These were imported slaves from Sri Lanka and Indonesia and Madagascar. Now, of course, a small group of them. Now, these guys had uniforms already. This is now in the growing Cape Town, and they could bear arms as slaves. And it seems that race played very little part in their law enforcement duties. For example, there was this instance where the danger of wildfires prohibited anybody from making a fire in Cape Town. These guys were tasked to, and I quote, soundly beat anybody caught smoking a pipe in public without distinction. So they were known as quite brutal and feared by pretty much everybody in the colony at the time. So by the time the British arrived, end of the 18th century, they replaced the Dutch as the rulers of the Cape Colony. Now they came to colonize. They were the leading industrial country at the time. They wanted to grow their economy, and they believed African colonies should feed into that and should serve the economy of the empire. What they did bring also was a more structured form of policing. The border police still maintained their paramilitary functions. This is in the rural areas, but the town police were now sort of mirrored on Sir Robert Peel's London Metropolitan Police model, which of course gave structure to policing. And of course they would change the Dutch Watch. For example, the name would change in 1840 to the Cape Police Force. So yeah, more structure, different name, still militant. Now by the mid-1830s, some of the farmers migrated into the rest of South Africa to, and I quote, to restore the traditional societal order of the Cape. In other words, they wanted to make the rest of South Africa, like Cape Town, great again. This caused, well, they established two republics under the approval of Britain, and the South African Republic, or the ZAR, actually had its own police force, also paramilitant in nature, as pretty much all the police forces back then were, because they were tasked with a lot of border defense. So the discovery of diamonds and gold in these republics, respectively in the mid-1860s and 1880s, inevitably brought Britain in war with the republics. This was a very expensive war for England. It would turn out to be. They came into the battle as thinking it was a tea time war. And that's a quote. And eventually, after a few years, they had to resort to immoral tactics to win this war, or to eventually let the republic surrender. And these tactics included summary public executions, scorched earth policies, and of course the infamous concentration camps, in which mainly women and children would perish. In the end, these concentration camps would be responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of South Africans of all races. This would, of course, also lead to a strong nationalist feeling among those who suffered because of this, because Britain never acknowledged these atrocities, and because of Britain's support of the hierarchy of race hierarchy, the race order structure, white politics still had standing. So the Afrikaners, who lost about 30,000 people in the concentration camps, pushed for separation with Britain, which they got in 1910 with the proclamation of the Union of South Africa. In 1912, that was the formation of the ANC. Under the, well, they would change their name in 1923. Sorry, these are 18s. In 1823. No, sorry, 19. It is 19, sorry. They would change their name in 1923 to the ANC. They were, of course, concerned about the only white politics in self-rule, and the government used the SAP to police these structures and to suppress any protest actions from the ANC. And this, of course, would grow over the years. Now, the SAP, the South African Police, was formed in 1913, and they were formed from the policing structures that were available in the colonies at the time of independence. And of course, they also had a pretty strong military influence. So much so that during the Second World War, one of the brigades of the SAP was still fighting with the South African Army, just to show the strong militant influence. Now, by 1947, the Fagan Commission recommended that all races in South Africa should live freely in towns and cities. And this concerned a large portion of the poor whites at the time. And the National Party, a pro-Afrikaans political party, jumped to the opportunity and promised to protect the whites from the black danger, as they called it. They got elected in 1948. The National Party ruled South Africa. That was the beginning of apartheid. They started quickly with some of the main apartheid legislations, like the first one over there that would classify people under 4 different race groups. The second 2 pieces of legislation that would prohibit people from living anywhere else except where their race group was supposed to, demarcated areas for that race group. The third one would create independent homelands, which was ethnically homogeneous and independent from South Africa. So in the end, if you were born in South Africa, you were black and born in South Africa, you would not be a South African, but part of one of these homelands. And of course, the fourth one, which prohibited marriage and sex between the different race groups. Now, of course, the ANC reacted again with large protest actions against this. The SAP was called in to defend against what the National Party would term throughout apartheid communist agitators. And, you know, by the end of the 80s, the South African police was key in the total strategy approach against the total communist onslaught. Now, it was pretty easy for the government to spread this kind of rhetoric among the public and the police members, because we have to look at the history and see that the West, during the heyday of apartheid, which was the 50s, the West supported South Africa because of its due strategic role on the continent as a buffer against, counterbalance against the spread of communism. And of course, in return, the Soviet Union would form allegiances with the opposition of the apartheid government. So yes, there was a link, and clearly the government would exploit that and use it in its propaganda strategy. So I've created a timeline here of historical events that all contributed to the collapse of apartheid. Now, it's by no means exhaustive. In lawyer speak, it's including but not limited to. And I've marked a few that I think is more important perhaps than others. But of course, everybody can differ on this. I'm sure Andrew would differ with a few. So we will look at just some of the outstanding issues here. First one, 1960, the Sharpeville massacre. This highlighted apartheid to the international community and probably the turning point in the power of the apartheid government. 69 protesters were killed on the day. Later in 1960, the ANC was banned. In 1962, of course, Nelson Mandela was arrested. 64 received a life sentence for sabotage and attempted insurrection. 1966, the SA Prime Minister H.F. Verwoerd, or also known as the architect of apartheid, was assassinated while giving a speech in Parliament. Now, this left the apartheid government rudderless for a while and without strategy. 1973, the UN's convention deemed apartheid a crime against humanity, which made it very difficult for the South African government to now ideologically defend its policies. 1975, South Africa was slowly getting pulled into a cross-border warfare. This would deplete the funds of the government steadily. In the end, it would be a sizable chunk of government expenses by the end of the 80s that they would spend on border patrols, border warfares. 1976, the Soweto protest that started in June of that year, ended in October, sort of. It necessitated several states of emergency. By the end of it, 600 to 700 people were killed and thousands were in detention again or arrested. Again, a PR nightmare for the South African government and bringing about much more criticism from the international community. 1977, of course, Steve Biko, the Black Conscious leader, dies while in SAP detention, yet more PR woes. And then, of course, the 80s, the financial cutbacks from Britain and from America in the calling up of short-term loans, not allowing any more investments, not allowing any more loans, which made it economically unsustainable for the South African government to continue with their policy of apartheid. 1990, of course, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. ANC was unbanned. This led to the 1993 interim constitution, which guaranteed one person, one vote in a democratic election. And of course, I didn't highlight this because everybody knows this. 1994, ANC wins the first democratic election, Nelson Mandela as president, which brings about the end of apartheid. Now, quick timeline run through. What happened to the police during apartheid? They operated parallel to the Homeland Police forces. These guys were considered to be poorly trained and more brutal than the SAP even. The SAP numbers continued to grow throughout apartheid because of the Defense Amendment Act that guaranteed conscriptions. Every white male above the age of 18 had to either serve in the military or police, which of course, yeah, so your numbers grow, but you are, you have a lot of members that had no business in being police officers to start off with. And of course, this would speak to the brutality that that is part of the SAP legacy. The SAP became, of course, progressively militant. Many of them were fighting the border wars. They would bring those tactics back to urban policing. And their training was evident of that. They focused on counterinsurgency and riot control. So by the end of the 80s, it's estimated that the South African police was responsible for the death of 3,000 people, whether in border warfare or in policing, in protests, control. And by the end of apartheid, and this came out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports, there were several rogue SAP assassination units, and then some weren't rogue at all. It was a bizarre story like Operation Coast. These guys specialized in biological and chemical weaponry used in assassination attempts. You want to read more about it? Google Wouter Basson. I think he was the head of that. Fascinating reading, fascinating. So after apartheid, where are we now? And this is where Andrew will connect very soon. In 1995, after the election, the SAP combined forces with the Homeland Police forces. Now, again, remember, you're talking about different structures, different policing training methodologies, different experiences, and of course, different ideas about what policing should be. The SAP were fighting in a war. The border police were even more brutal. So all of these were combined very hurriedly into the South African Police Service. The focus, according to the new constitution, would be on a democratic, accountable policing. In the late 90s, there was a surge in reported crime. Of course, whether this reflects on the trust in the police, whether these were actually reported crimes, that the crimes actually went up. We would not know, but the rhetoric changed from service to force again in government circles. So from the early 2000s to 2010, there were budget increases in the police. And of course, their personnel grew from 120,000 to 200,000, making them one of the biggest police services in the world at the time. 1997, we're talking about the investigative mandate, getting back to accountable policing. The Independent Complaints Director, the ICD, they were the first police complaints body. They failed in their mandate really because of workload and budget and size. In fact, 2 years into their existence, they already limited the definition of cases that they would investigate because of workload. And in 2011, they were renamed as the Independent Police Investigative Director, or IPID. These guys were quite effective. The Scorpions had then took over as the investigators of crime syndicates, criminal politicians, and priority crimes. They were independent from the police. They were located in the National Prosecuting Authority. They had a tremendous prosecution rate of more than 90%. They, of course, investigated, like I said, criminal politicians, corrupt politicians, and they were eventually shut down by the ANC because of the reason was giving organizational restructuring. They were replaced by the Hawks, from Scorpions to Hawks. Now, this investigative unit is located within the SAPS, making it less independent. And they've been frequently riddled with reports on abuse of power and links to corrupt politicians. In 2009, Jacob Zuma became the leader of the ANC and president of the country, and he started a slow 10-year systematic looting of state coffers and the abuse of the criminal justice system. So much so that the President Cyril Ramaphosa said in an interview that he believes the Jacob Zuma administration cost South Africa north of 30 billion US dollars. Which brings us to the National Police Commissioners. And we started with this, the revolving door of them, which really is troubling for the sustainability of control in the police, and also the consistency in policy. National Police Commissioners are, of course, the top echelons of the police. They're appointed on 5-year contracts, renewable. Now, for a quarter of a century, only one finished a full term, and I believe that was the first one. 9 police commissioners have been, there's been 9 police commissioners, 6 permanent, 6 were permanent appointees, and the rest were in acting capacity. Now, this is what happened to them. 3 were removed for corruption and maladministration. 1 was imprisoned, and the current National Police Commissioner is a career administrator, but he's already entangled in a tender scandal, although it's not been adjudicated. Pretty depressing, and also that photo. So I'm gonna turn you over to Andrew, who definitely will lift your spirits.
Okay, I'm just struggling to share my screen. Let me just try again. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. Thanks very much, Adri. Yes, Adri is the pessimist in our author team. So after that pessimistic overview, I'm going to work through quite quickly what we've called the social context. But just as Adri was talking, I've added in brackets beyond good cop, bad cop, and I've added that because I want us to think about what it means to police in a country that has the history that Adri has just painted for us. And I want to suggest, if we look at this diagram on the screen, that a good way to understand the forces that drive the culture of integrity within the South African Police Service and have bearing on the decisions police officials make as to whether to abuse their power, stand up to their colleagues, put their heads down and ignore what they see. We can understand that by understanding their personal trajectories against this history that we've just heard about in the South African context and in the context of police culture. So that triangle in the middle, the L stands for liminality. And I want to suggest that for many police officials, they find themselves stuck in a form of limbo. And why is it important to contextualize the lived experience of police officials? Well, as we know, policy, bills, legislation takes shape through the lens of the frontline civil servants who deliver them. So South Africa has an amazing constitution, amazing laws, everything is very progressive. But what do those laws look like once they've been put through the lens of a police official who has grown up in this country and is now operating in the South African Police Service? So if we look at the police culture sphere in the diagram, the police sociology literature has long described the socializing power of police organizational culture. A lot of this literature came out of the mid-20th century, and it came out of the UK and US. There are clear links. I think anyone who's worked in police organizations will see clear links around the world, but certain elements are less relevant to South Africa. What I want to highlight, however, is this idea that the way that stories manifest within police organizations shape the way that police practice takes place. So a mantra in police training is you learn the official version at police college, and when you get to the station or you get to your posting, you learn how real policing takes place. And that real teaching is imparted through storytelling. Your commanders, your colleagues tell you what really happened. So an example might be the Constitution says every South African has the right to dignity and respect and safety, so we can't use violence. The police are controlled by use of force regulations, but a story in a particular police station might be, we can't solve cases if we don't use force. They don't respect you unless you stamp your authority on them. And that kind of story can, of course, guide integrity violations, guide the bending of the law. A sense of mission, that idea that we are the thin blue line between order and disorder. In the South African context, as I'll talk about shortly, this is a particularly violent society. It's been described as a country at war with itself, where it is that people don't feel safe. And so it's easy as a police official to generate, well, as an organization, to generate a story to guide your members that we are the people who are supposed to keep people safe, and we can use that story to justify certain actions. I want to highlight isolation and solidarity. That comes out of the position that police organizations hold in a state structure. So police officials are citizens, but they are citizens representing the state, and in many respects, they are the face of the state on the street. So a police car is very visible. Police uniforms are very visible, and those are symbols of the state. And depending on whether the police are looked up to and trusted or not, police officials can therefore feel very isolated. And as a result, we don't trust the public, we don't trust the politicians, so we form a little bubble. And Sanja will later talk about the code of silence, which is kind of an informal rule within police organizations of we don't report each other because we have to look out for each other. Machismo, that sense of masculinity, again, historically, police organizations have been very male dominated. South Africa has one of the best gender balanced organizations with 30% female representation, but it is still a very masculine environment. I've done quite a lot of ethnography with police, and I was a police reservist, a volunteer, and there's definitely inappropriate flirtation, both in the stations and with the public. Inappropriate in sense of if one were judging it through a Western normative lens. Of course, the police officials don't necessarily think they're being inappropriate. And then pragmatism is just about we have problems and we need to solve them, and that links to performance culture. And this isn't something that's written about in the historical sociological literature, but it's key to modern police organizations. If any of you know anything about policing, you might have heard about CompStat, a performance management tool developed in New York in the early 90s, and now versions of it are used around the world, including in South Africa. But this kind of public management paradigm pervades public services everywhere. It's performance targets, metrics, log frames, inputs, outputs, activities, outcomes. And when you are held accountable to particular outputs and outcomes as a police official, that can have great bearing on the integrity with which you pursue the job. And I'll come back to that later. But ultimately, police can't control all the factors that shape crime, but they can change the way that crime is reported. They can change the public image, etc. Personal identity, very briefly, I define here simply as the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, which we believe to be true. So when a police official wakes up in the morning, what is the story going through his or her head? I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm a member of a police service, I have an obligation to serve my community, or this is just a burden, I can't get on, I need to pay my debts. What are these guiding narratives? And I want to suggest that we all wake up striving for ontological security. Anthony Giddens, the British sociologist, talks about ontological security as being the state in which we have answers to the existential questions in our life. So if I know that my healthcare is covered and my pension is sorted out, and I trust my employer and I trust my colleagues and my community respects me, then there's balance in my life. I have a clear story that guides me. But if I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to pay my mortgage, if I wake up without a job and I'm not sure if this country has a market that's going to be able to absorb me, that leads to a state of precarity. And this is what I want to contrast ontological security with. South Africa is a state of great precarity, precarity being precariousness, of course. And just to give you some sense of that precarity, and then to juxtapose it with what the South African Police Service offers people living in this precarious country. Adri's already painted a picture of our horrendous, difficult, violent past. What we can flag from that early 90s period is this birth of a South African dream. The nation building project changed. The slogans united in diversity, access for all, housing and jobs for all. These were mantras of the 90s. Many of them remain today. But that was the promise of the new country. It was, you have been oppressed. This country has never been just, but from now on, everybody will have equal access. And if we look at the personal narratives of police officials in the police today, many of them were raised with that kind of idea, going to school, believing they could be whatever they wanted to be. And I'll return to that shortly. I mentioned earlier, we have a very violent country. Our murder rate is 6 times the global average. In Cape Town, where I am right now, the murder rate is 10 times the global average. And yet the policing precinct that I'm in has almost no murder. And 5 kilometers down the road, the murder rate is 30 or 40 times the global average. So there will be 300 murders in one police area in a year, and there'll be none where I am. But clearly great inequality in safety and violence, but a violence that pervades the country as a whole. We have some of the worst, well, we have the worst income inequality. Of course, everything's relative to who can measure what, but it's fairly well established that we are terrible in terms of income inequality, low levels of trust in police and government as a whole, and that trust in police has deteriorated. I flag that because if I'm a police official, what is the narrative guiding my life when I believe the public doesn't trust me and when I don't trust the state? Almost half of the population is classified as poor. 43% in the last quarter of 2020 were unemployed using the expanded definition, meaning that includes people who've given up looking for work. By far the worst unemployment rate in the world. And I mean, that's what I talk about when I talk about precarity. How can we have a functional state, a just state, when you have 43% of your worker age population unemployed? Employment has, since the birth of democracy, been the thing that South Africans want government to address most pressingly, followed by housing and crime. But by far it is unemployment. Again, because when you wake up and you have a job, ontological security is far more readily in reach. Half of children who begin school don't finish, almost half. That's horrendous. So how do you realize that South African dream when our school system can't hold on to 45% of people who start school? Half of children experience violence at school. So violence, corporal punishment is illegal. As I say, we have an amazing constitution, but when you are the frontline state worker, you are the teacher and you don't know how to manage the children. You resort to the violence that has stayed with us from this very violent past that Adri explained. And finally, these income levels that I've mentioned here, they're old, but they're old because that was our last national census, 2011. And I just want to show the relative difference between average incomes and a police salary. So ignore the figure in terms of modern current rates, but engage with the figure as a relative income. So the average income in 2011 for a South African household was 103,000 Rand. The average income for a Black African headed household was 60,000 Rand. So already almost half the average income, and a starting salary in the SAPS was 101,000 Rand. And I just want to flag this because many people in South Africa don't realize that the lowest paid job in the South African police service puts you in the wealthiest 5% in terms of income earners in the country. We just have such an unequal society that is the case. That doesn't mean that you are rich when you become a South African police service officer. So in the overlap of this space, this personal identity, striving for ontological security in a very precarious country, in an organization that has a culture that can powerfully shape narratives, what bearing does this have on integrity? Common themes in police officers' lives are having been born into relative poverty, being exposed to violence at an early age. So we have violence accepting norms. I learned that respect and power are demonstrated through violence because I get beaten by my parents, I get beaten by my teacher. I'm generalizing, of course, not everybody is beaten, but there are early signals that violence is acceptable. This dream of a good life. There are children all over South Africa who dream. They are dreaming. People can be living in absolute poverty, but that South African dream is alive. I believe I can get somewhere. And that dream can be identified in the childhood narratives of many police officials today. However, even though they are resilient and they manage to finish school with 45% of their classmates dropping out, many of them realize that they don't have the funds to finish university. Their family can't help them complete their studies. And as a result, many of them end up in the South African Police Service. The South African Police Service isn't a job that you can just apply for and be accepted for. You have a less than 1% chance of being accepted. That's not because we have very rigorous selection criteria, but there will be 500,000 applications for 3,000 posts. So you are really lucky once you get in there. And I think of police officials in South Africa as accidental officers. And in this sense, they grow up with great ambition. They realize that South African dream is out of reach, and they accidentally find themselves in the SAPS. What does it mean once you accidentally find yourself in the SAPS? Especially knowing that growing up, many children didn't look up to police officers. Now I am this thing that I grew up hating. There is a form of cognitive dissonance. The personal narrative is rewritten, and people often realize, wait a second, this job does pay well. I do have a job for life. It's very difficult to be fired from the police, it being a government job. And suddenly that South African dream is kind of in reach again. However, because we have 42% unemployment, because we have this horrendous history of inequality and injustice, and because wealth and access and opportunity hasn't been redistributed equally, that police official who, if an individual in the world would now find themselves in the middle class, finds themselves weighed down, that salary needs to support vast networks of precarious kin. They must look after their parents, they must look after their unemployed siblings, they must look after the child with who they had born of their ex-girlfriend. And so this dream is in reach and it simultaneously slips away. And as a result, you find these narratives of, well, I'm never going to realize that dream, but at least I can provide a better education to my children. And so dreams are deferred to children. What does this mean for integrity? Firstly, I want to flag that absolutely in no way does poverty lead to misconduct. Poverty, inequality doesn't cause crime. These are simplistic narratives. However, I would suggest that this precarity, the fact that a police official can't necessarily see a clear path for themselves because there is so much precarity pulling them back. And yet there's this institutional performance culture that requires them to report on certain targets and to provide a front stage to South Africa and the world of a professional police organization. There's a conflict in that. And so the job is to be coveted. You don't want to lose a job in South Africa. There's a fiction at the heart of policing that we are professional, evidence-based, human rights respecting. We need to create a front stage image that promotes that fiction. Meanwhile, in the backstage, because we can't actually make South Africa safe, we cut corners. We will occasionally torture. We will abuse our power. We will accept bribes. I want to flag the fact that police abuse and police corruption in South Africa is probably not nearly as bad, well, at least the bribe taking, as many places north of our border and in Central and South America. So this is all relative. It's easy to speak about something as if it's the worst police organization in the world. Everything is relative. But I think the key to this narrative of precarity and stability is that even if I don't abuse my power, I'm not going to cause trouble by standing up to my colleague who's abusing their power because this job is too important. And that is something that is quite particular to South Africa. I might believe that everything my colleagues are doing is wrong, but it doesn't, unless I know that I have a commander who's going to look after me, it doesn't make sense for me to ruffle any feathers. And as a result, we have this organizational environment where you can simultaneously speak against abuse. You can simultaneously have great initiatives to tackle abuse of power and misconduct, and yet it can be very difficult to have police officials stand up to their colleagues. And we see the same thing in violent crime as well. People are afraid to stand up to violent offenders. I'm not going to talk about police stories shaping countryside, township, and affluent space. Suffice to say that we don't have an equality of policing in South Africa. So people living in poor areas, just like in the United States and other parts of the world, the poor receive a different kind of policing, a much more abrasive, coercive policing compared to the affluent spaces. The irony being that South African police officials generally come from and reside in those same poor spaces. And the fact that they come from and reside in them leads to justifying narratives. So I was a young man like you, I know what you're up to, and therefore I will use force to correct you. Whereas the affluent space that I am less familiar with because I come from relative poverty, I will serve those affluent residents and protect them from people like me. And so this question that I've got up here, Thabo Mbeki quoted Langston Hughes saying, what happens to a dream deferred in South Africa? And I mean, Thabo Mbeki was quite a while ago now as our president, but there has long been recognition that that South African dream has been deferred. And if we look at what that means in policing, this picture of houses, those are RDP houses, Reconstruction and Development Program, free houses provided to poor South Africans. I mentioned that a starting salary in the police puts you in the wealthiest 5%, and yet we have police living in RDP houses. We have police living in informal settlements and shacks, as you see in the bottom right. That dream has been deferred. And what does it mean? One way to earn respect when the market hasn't provided you with a dignified life is to stamp your authority on the people who the state or the criminal justice system has identified as less than, the person labeled criminal, the person labeled foreigner, this gentleman being towed behind a police car, Milo Masia. He was a taxi driver, he was a non-South African, and he was dragged and beaten to death. That other photo is SAPS officials having just killed 112 striking mine workers. So in summary, before I hand over to Sanja, South Africa is a land of violence, injustice, and precarity. SAPS officers are drawn from these precarious contexts. The organizational culture is a powerful socializer. And on the one hand, the SAPS as an organization offers officers the opportunity of ontological security. They didn't dream of becoming police, but once in there, they see, wait, I could actually potentially realize my middle-class ambitions here. However, for most, those precarious social networks drag them down. The wealth has to be shared and distributed. So the dreams are deferred to children, and people will either abuse their power and try to look after themselves, or they will ignore the abuse of their colleagues in order to get through their career, cash in their pension, and provide a better life to their children. And with that, I want to hand over to Sanja. Thanks very much.
You're muted, Sanja.
Okay, working now. Okay, thanks. So our empirical work is based on the theory of police integrity that Karl Klockus and I developed, which is organizational in nature. In other words, as Andrew pointed out, we are going beyond the understanding of police integrity being a problem or police misconduct being a problem of a few rotten apples, and rather we're talking about the organization. Sorry, something went wrong and I couldn't flip the screen. So let me just make sure that I go to the next one. Let's start again from this one. Oh yeah, final. So the first dimension of the theory focuses on the organizational rules and directly links the existence of official rules, as well as their extent, with the levels of police integrity in the police agency. Hence, a police agency of high integrity is an agency in which official rules have been established and police officers are familiar with official rules. However, the expectation is that not only police officers know the official rules, but also that they understand the rationale behind these rules and they're actually supportive of these rules. So misconduct in South Africa has been regulated by various types of rules, including the constitutional norms, statutory and common law rules, as well as SAP's official rules, such as the Code of Conduct and the disciplinary regulations. The second dimension of the theory focuses on various techniques that police agencies can use to control misconduct. And a police agency of high integrity not only has the official rules written down, but also enforces these rules consistently and effectively. So the enforcement of rules could rely on reactive control mechanisms, such as investigations of citizen complaints, or on proactive control mechanisms, such as ethics training. Police officers in agencies of high integrity can accurately tell what discipline would follow for any violation of the official rules. As we describe in detail in our book, there are many control mechanisms that have been put in place in South Africa, from external control mechanisms such as the scorpions or hawks that Adri talked about earlier, to the internal mechanisms of control such as the SAP's Integrity Management Service and the Anti-Corruption Unit. However, the SAP statistics show every year that very few police officers have been disciplined for police misconduct. The third dimension of the theory focuses on the code of silence, or the informal prohibition of reporting misconduct by fellow police officers. Although the code exists in every police agency, what differentiates police agencies of high integrity from the police agencies of low integrity is how strong the code is. In an agency of low integrity, the code is strong and protects even the most serious forms of police misconduct. There are only a handful of prior studies exploring the Code of Silence in South Africa, and they illustrate that the Code of Silence seems to be entrenched there. So before we go over the results, let me now explain how we collected the data. So we used a police integrity questionnaire that contains 14 hypothetical scenarios describing various forms of police misconduct, including police corruption, use of excessive force, and falsification of official documents. We purposely designed scenarios in a way to vary in terms of their seriousness. Upon reading each scenario, the respondents will ask how serious they evaluate behavior, whether the behavior violates official rules, what they think that appropriate discipline should be, what they think that the actual discipline is going to be, and how willing they are to report such misconduct. We surveyed about 900 SAPS officers from 39 police stations in all 9 provinces. In terms of their characteristics, our respondents are primarily male, Black, and line officers, in other words, non-supervisors. In addition, they are also experienced police officers. So let's now see what our respondents think about police misconduct. First, we'll look at how well police officers know official rules. As we go through the results, please keep in mind that all behaviors described in the questionnaire violate official SAPS rules. So when it gets to serious forms of police misconduct, such as abusing deadly force, stealing from a crime scene, or assaulting a suspect, the good news is that the majority of the respondents recognize such behavior as rule violating. The not so good news is that there is about 1/4 of the respondents who did not recognize even those most serious form of police misconduct as rule violating. For example, 28% of the respondents did not think that shooting an unarmed citizen in the back, a clear example of the abuse of deadly force, is a violation of official rules. The percentage is even higher, 36%, for the acceptance of a kickback from a local auto body shop. As expected, the respondents were somewhat less likely to recognize less serious forms of police misconduct as rule violating. For example, over 1/3 could not say whether the acceptance of gratuities is a violation of official rules. Furthermore, about 1/2 of the respondents did not perceive that covering up a colleague's drunk driving accident is a violation of the rules. And finally, the majority of the respondents, 54%, suggested that verbally assaulting a motorist is not a violation of the official rules. We asked our respondents to tell us what they think about the appropriate discipline, and as well as what discipline they estimate that the SAPS is going to mete out. While in 8 out of 14 scenarios, the respondents thought that the police officer who who engage in such behavior should be dismissed. In only 1 out of these 8 scenarios, they expected that the SEPs would actually dismiss for such behavior. Put differently, the majority of the respondents, 52%, anticipated that the SEPs administration would dismiss a police officer who accepted a bribe from a reckless driver. But for other serious violations of official rules, such as accepting kickback, abusing deadly force, or striking a handcuffed man in the kidneys, the majority of respondents said that SEP's administration would not dismiss the officer who has engaged in such serious forms of behavior. This slide shows the percentage of our respondents who expected dismissal for behavior such as stealing from a crime scene, abusing deadly force, submitting a false report, and accepting a kickback. In all of these scenarios, only a minority of police officers expected to be dismissed from the SEPs, while the majority of respondents expected some less serious forms of discipline, such as a verbal reprimand or a written reprimand. Lastly, let's look at the Code of Silence. Our first finding is that the police officers' evaluations of misconduct seriousness are positively and strongly related to how likely they are to say that they would report. When they evaluated misconduct as not being serious, they are more likely to say that they would be protected by the Code of Silence. On the one hand, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the respondents said that they would not report a fellow officer who engaged in less serious forms of misconduct, such as accepting a gratuity, verbally abusing a citizen, or causing a drunk driving accident. On the other hand, less than 10% stated that they would not report for the cases which they perceive to be serious, such as stealing a knife from a crime scene or abusing deadly force. Indeed, the Code of Silence seems to be weaker for misconduct which officers viewed as more serious. We have also asked the respondents to estimate how likely most police officers would be to report misconduct. Our results show that officers estimate that their fellow officers would be far less likely to report misconduct than they would be themselves. In fact, between 20 and 40% assume that their colleagues would not report even the most serious forms of police misconduct described in our questionnaire. In the end, the story of policing and police integrity in South Africa is a tale of a police agency that strives to adhere to the principles of democratic policing and principle, yet remains troubled by many challenges. In a police agency observing the principles of democratic policing, including those of accountability and police integrity, police officers should have no difficulty in recognizing examples of police misconduct as rule violations, supporting the official rules, expecting consistent discipline for violations of official rules, and expressing willingness to report, at least for the serious violations of official rules. While the details of the story, be it the long-term established systematic racism, political leaders with dubious agendas, a social culture supportive of the use of violence, or the consistent integrity failures of top police managers, may be contextual and country-specific, the findings about the contours of police integrity and their correlates have a more general, universal appeal and should resonate beyond the borders of South Africa. And with this, I'll stop here and we'll open the floor for your questions.
Thank you very much. A very interesting presentation. So audience, please use the Q&A space to type your question. You can also raise your hands if you want to talk. My question to you all is, how do you do away with the Code of Silence? Because it seems it's the biggest problem out there to police integrity.
Absolutely, it's the biggest problem, and we see it in the United States these days with the current trial. So it's an issue of where you break the code and how you do it. And our empirical results very clearly show that the code is the weakest for the most serious forms of misbehavior. In other words, this is where the police administrators willing to break the code should go. In other words, you should get the police officers to recognize that abusing deadly force, stealing from a crime scene, is something that their officers should report. And police administrators in the United States and abroad have been successful in dealing with the code of silence and making sure that officers do end up reporting such incidents in case they appear. But it's also part of the overall picture of how a serious officer perceives misconduct to be. If they don't see it as serious, they won't react. If they think that nothing is going to result as a discipline, then again, they will not report. So it's a complex picture. It's not just dealing with the code, it's dealing with the police integrity per se that police administrators would need to address.
I'll just add that I think, yeah, so Sanja's point is right. If you have an organizational culture where there are clear boundaries and people know that they will be supported if they report something, that's the institutional response you need. But unfortunately, as with so many challenges in South Africa, what we need to do is provide a dignified life to everybody. That isn't a simple policy response, but if I know that I'm not supporting 7 other people with my salary, it's much easier for me to take the moral high ground and report somebody than it is if my job has so much bearing on others' lives.
Very true. So let me read one question from William. Given the culture that you describe, how confident are you that survey responses are honest? What is the degree of error?
So when we designed the questionnaire, we did 2 things to see whether the police officers tell the truth. First, we had 2 questions at the back. The first one asked, do you think that most police officers would tell us the truth when they fill out the questionnaire? And the last question was, did you? So we clearly eliminated all of the respondents who either did not answer that question or answered explicitly they lied to us. And the second point is that we introduced a question, one of the hypothetical vignettes or scenarios where we knew that if police officers tell us this is very serious, they would report, we knew that they are lying. It's a case in which they administer a sense of street justice when they catch an offender. And in no country so far, we've seen police officers telling us this is very serious and they really are going to report this. So again, in South Africa as well, we have this finding. So we're pretty confident that the police officers are telling us what they seem to be their opinion. And when you talk about the code of silence, also, when you look at the side, the scale has 2 sides, the non-reporting side and the reporting side. And we're much more confident when they tell us on the survey that they will not report, that indeed this is how they would behave in reality, than when they tell us they would report. There are many steps from telling somebody on a survey that you would report to the point where actually go out and report something, as Andrew pointed out. So when they tell us they wouldn't report, we're pretty sure that this is what they would do. We are not so sure about the side when they tell us they would report.
Very good, thank you. And you said it in your conclusion that some of your findings can be extended beyond the South Africa. So right now, we're in the US, we cannot think about what's happening right now with the trials. So what are some big differences, for instance, in what's happening in the US and maybe what's happening in South Africa? If there are any.
Well, it's difficult to draw conclusions because the US system is highly decentralized with about 18,000 police agencies with different sets of rules. And in South Africa, we're talking about one large entity with about 200,000 sworn. So even the NYPD, the largest US police agency, is not even close in the numbers to the SAPs. However, there are some common themes when you compare our research in South Africa with our research in the United States. There are some common themes, like the links between how serious police officers perceive misconduct to be and their willingness to report, or their expectations about what appropriate discipline should be for these behaviors. Like in all the countries that we surveyed so far, we found that police officers are much more likely to expect or think that a less serious discipline is appropriate for the acceptance of gratuities or verbally abusing a citizen than for more serious cases, such as, for example, using deadly force, abusing deadly force, or stealing from a crime scene. So, I mean, there are many parallels like that where it's very clear that this is not something that is only happening in South Africa, but it's well applicable to other countries as well.
Yeah, I think that in terms of that organizational culture literature, one finds similarities in attitudes across countries. I think in terms of the broader abuse of power environment in the US versus South Africa, I suppose in terms of the scandals and attention around the killing of African Americans in particular, South Africa wouldn't have the same because South Africa has a majority Black police service and a majority Black population. So I think in the South African environment, what I hinted at and what I skipped over was what we have here is a class-based policing. So the poor receive very different policing experience to the wealthy. That doesn't mean that the wealthy receive wonderful policing experience. The wealthy are far more likely to have private armed response in addition to the police service. So there's a massive private security industry in South Africa. The figure that's often put out there is 4 private security officials for every South African police officer. But in terms of killing by police per capita, South African police kill at a rate 6 times American police. So we have a much greater use of force. And yet we don't have the same outcry about police violence in South Africa. Okay, wait, let me take that back. We have a huge outcry of police violence in terms of protests and things like that. But when it comes to the criminal being killed, there's often sympathy, there's often kind of celebration of that kind of thing. So again, it's this mess of a violence accepting norm. So violence is considered legitimate in many contexts by South Africans. And so, an academic called Anthony Collins wrote a great article once called "Violence is Not a Crime," and it was basically looking at perception data and how most experiences of violence aren't considered criminal because most experiences of violence occur between people who know each other. It's only when a stranger perpetrates violence against me that it becomes a crime in my mind. And so when the police use violence against that person, I support it. But when the police use violence against me, I don't. So there are quite a few differences, but in terms of organizational attitudes and codes of silence, I think there'll be lots of similarities.
And also, I think there is a long history of systematic racism and the police being in charge of enforcing discriminatory laws in both countries. I mean, even if you think about the United States, Brown versus Board of Education was only happening about 60 years ago. So it's not that the USA has a long history of non-racism. Rather, this is something that's with us and it's still present to this day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that I don't know how fair this is, but I often, I often say that South Africa is the kind of upper middle income version of the United States. So the United States is the most violent, wealthy country in the world, and the most unequal wealthy country, and South Africa is just one of the most wealthy and unequal. And so there are similarities in terms of the inequality of of the respective countries. Awa, can I respond to this question in the Q&A? What policing reform efforts are taking place?
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So unfortunately, I think we're undergoing perpetual reforms. As Adri explained, we've had a series of national commissioners, a few of which have managed to introduce any significant reforms. We had real challenges. I mean, firstly, one must acknowledge that the South African Police Service has changed entirely. It went from it is representative of the country in terms of demographics. It is very different to what it was in the mid-90s when it was formed. Training has changed, stations have changed. Yeah, there's been lots of change, but we have a leadership crisis. Part of this rapid transformation of the organization was people who shouldn't have been leading an organization of 200,000 being put in very senior positions where they didn't have the competencies to lead. And under the Zuma administration in particular, we had what has come to be seen as state capture. So Jacob Zuma deploying key allies into the head of the crime intelligence, the head of the police, the head of various, the prosecuting authority. So basically shielding himself from the criminal justice system by having allies there. And Cyril Ramaphosa is still slowly, as one has to, as happens in a democracy. You can't just click your fingers and kick everyone out. Those people are protected by labor laws and employment contracts. And so we have a hugely bloated senior management, many of whom shouldn't be there and are left over. And there's also factionalism within the police. So people who were from the Zuma era may not trust the people who were there beforehand or who have come afterwards. And there is a slow effort to address that, including through the reform of the prosecuting authority and the empowering of the prosecuting authority, giving them an investigative capacity, much like the Scorpions that Adri talked about, and the hope that they will then be able to take out the big blockages in the leadership of the SAPs, and that once that leadership is addressed, hopefully things will filter down. But there are some amazing leaders. I spent today in a workshop with police with an amazing station commander working in a very difficult area. There is just huge variation. But in terms of organizational reform, we could start at the top. Adri or Sanja, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Andrew, I agree completely. That's where the transformation should start, and also addressing all forms of police misconduct must start from the top. That would bring trust back from the members, which is a reoccurring comment that we get when we do face-to-face questionnaire completions. That's probably their biggest gripe, is that they would ask, why do you let us fill in this questionnaire? You should give it to the top management. That we get every time. Which sort of reflects back to the question about whether these guys would be truthful in their answering. Oh, they are, because they don't really fear repercussions from the top. I've not really come across that.
And also, if you think about the reform, the police officers should not feel that the reform has been imposed from the top. In other words, it's important because police commissioners portray the image and show by example and have control over all aspects of the police organization. But at the same time, if the police officers do not feel that that's something that they're motivated to do, the reform will not go very far.
Thank you. We have a comment by Tolio. This is more of, it will be difficult to get away with the blue code of silence. Besides the name change from SAP Force to SAP Service, nothing actually changed. There seem to be defenders of status quo in SAPs who makes transformation difficult. So, and I just wanted to, you mentioned the need for change at the top, but recently, for instance, what happened in Nigeria, we have the population, like the Ansar movement, like, is there anything like that in South Africa where the population itself is asking for change?
Yes, I mean, if there's one thing South Africa has, which has remained from the anti-apartheid struggle, is a very active and vibrant civil society. And so we have a strong independent media that probably the media was key to getting us through the Zuma years, because much of the state was captured by the Zuma administration, and the media helped to hold him accountable when accountability mechanisms failed. And South Africa, people disparagingly often refer to protest culture, how protest is part of South African culture. Every day there are protests all over the country. They're not all about police, of course, but police are often involved, and if police end up shooting, firing rubber bullets, which happens almost daily, or somebody is injured, there is coverage in the media, it is a national story, and there is public outcry. And something we've seen since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, during the initial lockdown in South Africa was one of the harshest in the world. People were told to stay home. You can't go to the shops unless for emergencies, you could leave home, but we weren't allowed to go outside to exercise or anything. And police and the military were deployed. And of course, they weren't trained for this, and they hadn't ever faced anything like this. But this is where we saw the kind of culture and attitude of violence and coercive control coming out. We had police with shamboks, which are leather whips, which we haven't. It's kind of it's a symbol of apartheid policing, which we haven't seen in the media since the apartheid days, really. And we have photos of police whipping people because they were outside when they should have been in lockdown. We've got pictures of police holding shotguns with rubber bullets 2 meters away from people queuing to buy food because they aren't keeping 1.5 meters distance. And out of that came a huge resurgence of civil society activity to try to hold police accountable and change this. And I think that is going to carry on. Very sadly, I mean, this idea of the dream deferred, for the past 5, 6, 7 years, every year we've seen student protests at universities because university literally changes one's life in South Africa. It has huge outcome benefits around the world, including in the US, but it has something like 6 times the benefits in South Africa if you look at your lifetime earnings with a degree compared to not having a degree. And yet so many people get accepted into university and yet can't pay the fees. And we have protests around the fees. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, students were protesting in Johannesburg and police responded with rubber bullets and killed an innocent bystander. And there is just public outrage. And so there's definitely outrage. The problem is the government driving change, holding people accountable. Adri, it looks like you want to add something.
Yeah, no, I just want to add to that, just to put it in perspective. South Africa had one of the strongest or harshest lockdowns during the COVID pandemic. And the police often worked in conjunction with the military. And in the beginning, there was confusion about who's spearheading the operations or the lockdowns. So you would get violent clashes with people for breaking a curfew, which would result in horrendous injury to citizens. So lots of confusion. I think the military probably should not have been called in from the beginning, but that's personal opinion. Like Andrew rightfully said, I am the cynicist in the group. Believe it or not, after his speech, he's the optimist.
Thank you. I think, Charles, you can go ahead. Charles, do you have a question or comment?
No comments.
Oh, okay. So you raise your hand. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question here. Professor Ivkovic, what is your definition of police integrity, and what are the various components that cohere to form this construct of police integrity?
We see police integrity as this tendency to resist temptations of one's own job. In other words, we are talking about various aspects of it, and we talk about this being both a feature of individuals and a feature of organizations. And at the same time, this is a normative inclination, in other words, tendency. So that's your tendency not to react in a particular way. Although you may have certain motivations to beat up the suspect after you chase him for 10 blocks, your police integrity will prevent you from reacting on your instincts. And we have a whole book, Contours of Police Integrity and Enhancing Police Integrity, in which we talk about what police integrity is and various elements of it. So we build up upon that definition in this book as well.
Seems we don't.
Well, there's a question from Giovanni in the chat, which I was typing a response to in case we didn't have time, but I'll quickly give a quick response, and Adri or Sanja might want to add something. But the question is really, what does a good police person look like in this difficult context? And what I was typing was, of course, there are thousands, tens of thousands of good, dedicated police officers who are compassionate and want to serve their communities and do the best they can. I would say that however, you can have that attitude and do your best, but when you are drowning in violence, when you are drowning in paperwork, your impact is limited. And even if you are dedicated and compassionate and doing your best when you're engaging a victim, you may still not stand up to your colleague who is abusing somebody. And so that's where this culture of integrity comes in. But I mean, there are, again, at a station 10 kilometers down the road here, a murder detective will have 100 murder cases that they are supposed to be investigating, and they may passionately want to serve that community. But Giovanni, I think you are a law enforcement official, or were a law enforcement official, and I'm sure you know that no detective is going to be able to simultaneously investigate 100 murder dockets, and so the system crushes the best of them. But positive attitudes do exist. I don't know if anyone else wants to add something.
Yeah, I'll say something on that. I believe being in the law profession and working with the cops closely, basically on both sides, prosecution and in defending police, I think what makes an officer great is a lot of career capital, a lot of experience. When I say a lot, of course, this is relative to what he's doing. I mean, in South Africa, like Andrew explained, you can have 5 years of experience out in the streets of South Africa. It's probably the equivalent of a lifetime of experience in New York, probably, or elsewhere. So career capital definitely would allow you to use your discretion, and I think with that, it's the same in any profession. Empathy. You combine policing experience with empathy, and you get great discretional actions, which would more often than not result in more positive outcomes between police and citizen interaction.
Yeah, and let me just add that our book doesn't intend to create profiles of individual officers. Rather, our approach is organizational in nature, and we try to see how not rotten apples, but rotten orchards shape the employees. In other words, why do police officers in South Africa behave that way? What is the organization doing or not doing so that they're behaving this way? Or why they have such attitudes? What kind of messages the organization is sending by having 9 commissioners and very few finishing their full term, right? What's happening, what kind of message is being sent when a police commissioner actually ends up in prison for police corruption? So that's the focus of our book. This is where we wanted to put the emphasis.
Okay. Charles wants to know in which African countries has work on police integrity been done? If you...
Okay, so the assumption here is that I know all the countries where the work has been done. So unless a scholar from that country lets me know, I would not know. So we know that, of course, South Africa is the one. Then we know that somebody in Nigeria did a study. And I think this is pretty much it for African countries. So there is still a lot of room open. If you're interested in doing police integrity research, I would be happy to tell you what you need to do and how we can do that together.
Thank you.
If you can add to that, it's also very relative to the country that you are in. Policing systems differ vastly across the continent. Like in the Congo, for example, it's completely different than in South Africa. The police have got a different mandate. Everything is different. So it's going to be difficult to replicate what we've done in South Africa in the Congo, for example. I think the question there, of course, might not even be relevant in some of the more important issues. So yeah, that's a challenge.
Okay. Any last words? We have 1 minute left.
Just to say that you can ignore the text that I was writing to Giovanni. I was trying to delete it and I accidentally sent it, and now it's in the panel. But I was trying to respond to Toli. Toli made a comment about how the performance culture in the South African Police Service drives misconduct, and that links to what I was suggesting in terms of if I wake up and I come to work and my objective is to tick these performance boxes, they can be in direct opposition to providing good service to the community, because a victim comes in, I don't want their crime on my books because people talk of being in the red and being in the green. It's this typical CompStat type crime going up and down. And so I fully support Toli's observation that there is a big problem with performance cultures that are misaligned with democratic policing.
Thank you so very much for coming today and sharing your study with us. We appreciate it. And thank you everybody who attended and asked questions. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye, everybody.
Thank you
Thanks
for
for having
inviting
us.
us.
Bye.
Thank you all so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.